I started from the beginning with Aristotle's Politics, which is kind of the foundation for most subsequent political theory, and pointed out that he assumed that it's mostly, a lot of it's about democracy, and he took it for granted that a democracy would be fully participatory and that it would aim for the common good, but that in order to achieve that, the democracy would have to be what we today call a welfare state, which would ensure lasting prosperity for the poor, relative equality, and moderate but sufficient property for everyone. If there are extremes of poor and rich, or if you don't if you don't make sure that there's lasting prosperity for everyone, then you can't talk seriously about a democracy. And he went on to, and then I mentioned that idea runs right through the good bit of the tradition, up until through the Enlightenment and classical liberalism, including the major figures like de Tocqueville and Adam Smith and others. It's just kind of assumed, Jefferson and so on. There's another point that Aristotle made which took a little twist in our own constitutional system. He pointed out that if you had a perfect democracy, this is kind of theoretical, his discussion in part, if you have a perfect democracy, and you haven't granted lasting prosperity to the poor, and you do have big differences of wealth, very rich and a small number of very rich and a large number of very poor. In that case, in a perfect democracy, the poor will use their democratic rights to take away the property of the rich. And he regards that as unjust, and if it is unjust, there are two possible solutions. One is to eliminate poverty, the other is to eliminate democracy. Well, James Madison, who was no fool, noticed the same problem, and whereas Aristotle's solution, a couple of thousand years earlier, was to eliminate poverty, Madison's was to eliminate democracy. So he discusses quite explicitly in the Constitutional Convention that we have this problem that if we do have democracy, then the majority of the poor will use their power to do things like what we would nowadays call agrarian reform, and that can't be tolerated. That would be unjust, since the primary goal of government is, in his words, to protect the minority of the opulent against the majority. And in order to, and he also, no fool again, pointed out that over time, as time goes on, this problem is going to get worse, because there's going to be a growing percentage, a part of the population that will suffer from the serious inequities of the society, and will secretly long for a more equal, equitable distribution of life's blessings. And if they have the vote, they may do something about it, which is unacceptable, not for Aristotle's reasons, but because it would threaten the wealth and power of the opulent minority. So he therefore designed a system which is pretty stable, in which you would make sure that democracy didn't function, that, as he put it, power would be in the hands of the more capable set of men, those who hold the wealth of the nation, and the rest would be factionalized and marginalized in various ways. So that's one solution. The problem is real. Whether you decide it's a problem or not is another question, but the fact is correct. If you have a democratic system with large inequities of wealth, and the great majority is impoverished and doesn't have access to that, and secretly sighs for a more equitable share of life's blessings, in Madison's words, then they'll probably do something about it. And they have mechanisms in a democracy. That part is correct, which means they will threaten the rights of the wealthy to control the property. And remember, property rights are not like other rights, contrary to what Madison and a lot of modern political theory says. If I have the right of free speech, it doesn't interfere with your right of free speech. But if I have property that interferes with your right to have that property. You don't have it, I have it. So the right to property is very different from the right to freedom of speech. This is often put very misleadingly about rights of property. Property has no right. But if we just make sense out of this, maybe there is a right to property. One could debate that, but it's very different from other rights. And it is surely the case that if the majority lacks the property and is suffering and secretly desires a more equitable distribution, they have mechanisms to do something about it. That's right. And as I say, there were two solutions. The classical one was to eliminate poverty. The one on which our own society was founded was to eliminate democracy. That's sort of worth understanding. And it takes various forms over the years, but the problem never ends. And we're facing it right now. I mean, if a democratic society were allowed to function, it's extremely unlikely that the things that are now called inevitable results of the market would ever be tolerated, because they simply concentrate wealth and power and harm the vast majority, and there's certainly no reason for people to tolerate that.
Against this backdrop of globalization and the growth and power of transnational corporations, what actions should be taken to reverse this process?
Well, it depends what time span and range you're thinking of. I mean, you read constantly that this is somehow inevitable, no way to stop it, like Thomas Friedman in yesterday's Times or whatever it was. People who just mocks people who say you can do something about this. Well, that's certainly not true. For one thing, we should be aware of the scale of globalization. In many ways, what's called globalization is bringing about a situation which is not unlike what it was when, say, at the early part of this century. If you look at gross measures, like, say, trade and investment flow, and so on, it's relative to the economy. It's getting back to more or less where it was. Like, the one major change is the style of financial flows, which is extremely fast and overwhelms governments and so on. Okay, that's new. But there's nothing inevitable about that. That's public policy. I mean, it resulted from two major things. One, a decision to break down the system of regulated currencies, which is a policy decision made first by the Nixon administration, and another by the telecommunications revolution, which is just the normal form of public investment and public cost of the public assuming vast costs and risks, and then handing it over to private power to use. But these aren't things that are at all inevitable. The fact that the whole system is coming to resemble in many ways what it was early in this century, apart from things like this, that's been made in quite mainstream circles. Incidentally, it's not an unusual idea, though the differences are crucial, but under control. Now, beyond that, almost about 3/4 of the international transactions, like trade, for example, and investment and so on, are within Europe, United States, and Japan. Okay, these are all areas where, in principle at least, mechanisms already exist which allow the public to control what happens. That aside, transnational corporations are also a public gift. They were created, their rights, the rights of corporations altogether, were created mostly by the judicial system. They were granted extraordinary rights early in this century. The public doesn't have to agree to that. In fact, they don't have to exist at all. All of that's under public control. That aside, maybe we've talked about this, if you look at the top transnationals, they rely very heavily on public subsidy. In fact, according to the major study that exists, about 20% of them wouldn't even survive if it wasn't for public takeovers. Well, all of this is under control, in principle, up to the long-term goal, which I think has very deep roots in working class movements and Enlightenment thought, even in classical liberalism, that these institutions have no right to exist at all. They're fundamentally illegitimate. and they're not a law of nature. In fact, their current form is rather recent. They can be changed like other oppressive institutions have been changed. So what are the limits? Without limit.
But where do you see the fissures? Where do you see those openings where popular resistance can be mobilized around?
Well, right now, without anybody calling for it, about 95% of the population, which is not small, thinks that corporations should sacrifice profits for the benefit of their working people and their communities. Well, that's 95% is a good place to start. Now, I don't see why. Notice that call presupposes their right to rule. It says be kinder. 95% of the public thinks they should be more benevolent autocrats. All right, that's a place to start. Let's make them more benevolent autocrats. But I think that same 95% can easily recover, and may indeed already have, a point of view that has been articulated all the way through the working class movements, that they don't have any right to rule at all. It's not that they should be more benevolent autocrats. There should be no autocratic structures. So to repeat what mill hands were saying around here about 150 years ago, those who work in the mills ought to own them. Okay. So we move from the idea that the autocrats should be more benevolent, which is correct and fair, to the question of whether there should be autocratic structures. And I don't think that's a long move.